Hello and welcome to the Miko Bits show, and I'm your host, Miko Bits. Today I have Wil Robinson from Alliance, which is really one of the most, well, I'll say it, the most exciting DeFi and GameFi accelerator and DAO. So it's really a great honor to see him here on the show. So welcome, Wil.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, super exciting. So I guess what I'd love to have you do is talk a little bit about a little bit about the DAO, because I think it'd be great for people to get familiar.
Sure. So, Alliance was born 2.5 years ago as the Chicago DeFi Alliance,
Yep.
when Imran Khan was basically rallying different institutional market makers to get together and support DeFi protocols. The biggest problem we had was this chicken and egg, where you can't have a market if you don't have sellers, and you won't have sellers if you don't have a market. And so the idea was to figure out a way to get this initial cohort of DeFi projects to basically connect with the big boys. And this is Jump Capital, Jump Trading, um, Cumberland, CMT Digital. Later we add on Wintermute. We have so many. But this initial cohort was Synthetics, Zero X, Kyber, Token Sets, DYDX, Open. It's like incredible all-star cast. With the time, like didn't matter. And they were so grateful to be like hanging out on the phone with Imran and market makers, figuring out how to accelerate. Fast forward a year and a half, I joined the accelerator to run operations as the program manager and now head of accelerator at the DAO. Was renamed DeFi Alliance, and then as we raised to become a DAO, we're like, you know what? We're losing too many GameFi projects. We're losing too many DAO projects, thinking all we do is DeFi. And like, quite frankly, I believe that DeFi, Web3, crypto, and blockchain are all synonymous because it's all about the internet of value. But we shed that label. So what does our DAO do? What are we trying to think about? Well, we're an accelerator DAO. We focus on accelerating teams and making sure that these Web3 founders refer us. That's like our only like North Star. Do founders love us? If so, we're doing our job. And the ultimate purpose is to build this transnational state of builders. We want this to be the Ellis Island to Web3, where bring all your Web2 founders who are sad that they are in Web2. Bring all your Web3 founders who are ready to accelerate. Like we'll launch you into this Illuminati of Web3. And so we've got our 3% acceptance rate, and we're doing really well at like building this sticky cohort of excellence.
Wow. I love how rhapsodic that is. And it's a beautiful metaphor with this Ellis Island because Meta Kovan, the buyer of the most famous Beeple art, said that crypto is the new America, right? So if crypto is the new America, then Alliance is the new Ellis Island. It's sort of the
It's
welcoming.
probably no surprise that Meta Kovan is one of the largest contributors to the DAO.
Yeah, absolutely. And full disclosure, my fund, Gumi Cryptos Capital, is an investor in the DAO, and we're obviously super excited about all of the fine work. So one of the things I'd love to dip into is, you've been running GameFi cohorts. I guess what I'd love to hear is a little bit about kind of how did you come to be doing that?
Sure. So the reason I actually joined the DeFi Alliance at the time was because I'd been in crypto forensic audit, doing a lot of financial regulation work, making sure that the Ethereum Foundation had the funds it said it did in its multi-sig wallets, making sure that exchanges in Korea or Malta or Canada had the crypto that they claimed that were on their balance books. I myself had been defrauded by Gerald Cotton at Quadriga, and so
Oh my
took it
god!
personally to just make sure that crypto was there when they said it was.
Oh my god!
Uh, and so I worked with Grant Thornton, and Grant Thornton has amazing crypto clients on his list at the time. We had Circle and USDC and Coinbase, and, the list went on. And so uh, that's why I joined, and I joined because I was bullish DeFi. I love the idea of building new protocols that were organizing people. Uniswap blew my mind. 10x cheaper fees than Coinbase, and there's like a 5-man team. What? That's amazing. So that said, after doing a cohort of DeFi and a second cohort of DeFi, it became clear that games were finally entering the sort of space of crypto, for real to me. Now you knew way ahead of time, like you were months lead on me, and because I'd been bearish games for so long, and the reason I've been thinking about games for so long in crypto was because I joined from a PhD in game design. So I'd been teaching
Oh,
game design, love
amazing.
games. Yeah, it was fun. I actually hate games and I love games. Like I hate a lot of games and I love a small amount of games.
Oh, there's juicy topics there. It's super. I love this PhD, all the way in the game design field. Like that makes you like an incredibly rare species, right? Like, who all is like you're the professor. Like you're like Dr. Game Design. So like tell me how does that relate to kind of what you're seeing today, right? Like how does a doctorate in that area apply?
Sure. So I'd like to be clear that my doctorate was not an engineering degree. It was a philosophy degree. I was
Wow.
in an interdisciplinary section between English, communications, and sociology. And the reason I was there was because I was studying film and I was scared that my film colleagues were watching way more cinema than me. I didn't have like a moat, so to speak. It wasn't a defensible academic position.
I love
But
that.
I was passionate about games. I was playing a lot of games and a variety of games and thought, okay, I'll just take what I'm learning in cinema, I'll apply it to games. And the professors were like, we don't think you should do that, but if you do it, at least tell us why games are better or different than cinema. Because they had no idea, like, right? Like games were some weird fad to them. And I started looking at procedures in games, rules in games, and thinking about how designers communicate through their rule sets and lead people to behave the way they want them to, sort of
Oh, so
sculpt their
cool.
experiences through incentives,
Yeah.
uh, which is what economists do all the time. But I was doing it from like a totally artsy fartsy philosophical position.
Wow. Like I'm so excited. I consider myself to be a bit of a philosophical person in my inclination. Don't have that much formal training in it, honestly. But like to me, one just a throwaway question is like top 3 games from that era. Like, what are your top 3 that you kind of just really impacted you?
Sure. So there were games that were like gamer games that I love because I felt like they broke this pattern of like gameflation is what I call it. So every
Mhm.
year, games get a little bit better. We learn more about the technology. We come with more fun rules. We start taking away painful things that used to exist. We find new delightful experiences. But there were always these games that sort of were blips along the line that just grew faster, an experience that no one was expecting. So the one that always comes out to me is Demon Souls. It's this
Oh,
game
wow.
that came out on PlayStation. It like created the entire Souls genre, Dark Souls 2,
Yeah.
Bloodborne. And for me, seeing a game where it's a single player experience, but there's a community sort of embedded in the experience, that was really cool. Like when someone dies, the floor stains bloody red in your game, and you can like read the blood to see how they died, so you don't die the same way. Because there's a lot of dying in this game. Or like when someone finds something cool, they can write a message on the floor, and that shows up in every player's game, and they can read it and learn. And like this kind of community, was very exciting to me. Like there's a boss at one point who's so old he like doesn't want to fight you, and he says, "You know what? I'm going to pull a player from another game who's playing their own game right now and promise them a gorgeous hat that shoots like magic missiles if they beat."
Oh,
Um, and so like it becomes all of a sudden a PvP game and a PvE game because they were just ready to make that really high touch experience. Chef's kiss, so
wow.
good. So that's
Amazing.
my like really top one playery game. But
Yeah.
I did a lot of research on like indie games that are like boring but cool. Uh, right? I had this favorite game designer named Jason Rohrer, whose works are included in the MoMA. Um, particularly Passage, which is like a 5-minute game about whether you should get married and live a life of adventure, or whether you should like dig deep and look for asymmetrical upside by searching for treasure chests in like a local area. And it's
Ooh,
basically this.
how are those two things like the two choices?
So the way the game works is like along the x-axis, every time you take a step, you make a point. If you get married, every time you take a step, you make 2 points.
Ooh.
And so that's interesting. But there's another way to make points. You go down the y-axis, and treasure chests start showing up. But so do walls. More walls the deeper you go. More treasure chests the deeper you go. And it becomes hard to make forward progress along the x-axis while looking after treasure chests. And it gets even harder if you get married, because those walls create really cramped corridors. And often you see a chest you could just barely get, but if you were married, absolutely no chance. Your sprite would be
That's
too double wide, and you couldn't
crazy.
make it.
Are you married?
And this was this like amazing, like rule-based communication, right?
Yeah.
Like in life, there are 2 ways to score in this like sort of artist's like rudimentary depiction. And you get about equal score if you get married or go for treasure chests.
Wow.
But then like if you like discover the secret of the treasure chests, because there's like these little gemstones on them, treasure chests are like way better to chase after. Um,
Oh, don't get married with
so that's like this,
treasure.
like, but don't get married unless like, well, if you're a ungodly genius. I feel like that's the message, right? If you can like figure out the puzzle of the treasure chest, which is a really hard puzzle. Like I needed spreadsheets and I needed like a team of people to uncover. And when I got to it's open source. I almost cheated. I did cheat. Like I went to go read the open source. How does that puzzle chest work? It was written in assembly, that part of the open source code, so I couldn't decipher what the actual trick was.
Oh,
That was
I love
amazing.
it. I love it. I love it. That is super amazing. To me, the thing that I've been thinking a lot about is I've been thinking a lot about freedom, right? And
Sure.
I've been thinking about individual freedom, right? Which is kind of I do what I want. And then I've been thinking about kind of collective freedom, which is more like we make the rules together, right? So in a way, like that game has that quality of like you can kind of expand in these two directions almost as spatial dimensions, right? Like you can kind of go for like depth, right? So you're kind of like going vertically towards kind of your independent individual freedom, right? But then in a sense, like there's this also kind of maybe horizontal axis play where you're sort of like thinking about collective freedom, right? So it's super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And look, he could have added like you find a child along the way, and now every step is worth 3 points, and another one, and it's 4 points, and could have argued that like starting a family is just as valuable, but like that's not the claim. And so what I liked
Yeah.
was looking at artists arguing through rules, right? And we call this procedural rhetoric in game design.
Mm,
Very cool.
yeah, to me, I do love this, right? Because I've been thinking a lot about kind of story, right? And I've been thinking a lot about what I call universe rules. And because I've been thinking about gamer centric transmedia, right? So you think
Hmm.
about like what's happening with Arcane and like the Runeterra universe by Riot Gaming, right? And you kind of see this fully realized kind of transmedia franchise that's gamer centric, right? And to me, the thing that's so interesting is that there are these kind of universal rules, right? And in a sense, the players press against the universal rules. Like in Arcane, I don't want to do spoilers, but like, the character Jace and Victor are kind of pressing against the universal limit of Hextech, right? Like they're just seeking out this kind of possibly terrifying energy in the universe, and so they're pressing against it. But the thing that I think makes it fun is that each character has their own character laws, right? So you have characters like Jinx, who's like slightly nuts, and like, but that defines kind of how the interplay occurs, right? So I've been thinking a lot about kind of like the creation of universes and how they're lawful, right? So when you think about a game environment is kind of the ultimate lawful environment, right? Because in a sense, like here are the rules, and off you go.
Sure. And that's actually something I taught when I was in English, because transmedia storytelling is obviously a topic for like English literature people.
Yeah.
Um, and gamer centric is a newer phenomenon, right? We had like early great examples from The Matrix, where the Wachowskis were like, if you want to get this story, you're going to need to watch the movie. You're going to need to read the comic. You're going to need to play the video game. You're going to need to watch the short story. And it was the first time that a piece of story was actually like locked in the game, right? That was part of the franchise, but it still felt very like film centric. Game centric worlds are this exciting new space because gamers own a lot of media now. That's very exciting.
I'm excited because I feel like gamers are not stretching their legs yet. And what I mean is like gamers rejected the Ghost Recon NFT drop from Ubisoft, right? And it was just such a full-throated rejection, right? It was really insane, right? So like I don't feel like gamers feel like they're being centered. I don't think they're feeling yet the ownership and the power, and like they're not feeling like they're in charge.
Well, that drop was really interesting, right? Because it was on Tezos, which is a proof of stake chain. Um, but the players all assumed that there were terrible ESG consequences to accepting these NFTs, like that the environment was being burned alive for these NFTs, and like just like a
Wow.
complete misunderstanding of the technological stack.
Wow.
At the same time, it like Ubisoft is a very Web 2 company. It's hard for them to like
Yes.
stick their nails into Web 3 and understand it. They incubated Axie and couldn't get a check-in.
Oh
Like
my god.
because they like like imagine the embarrassment of being so boomer that you can't even find the most successful game like when it's in front of you.
Oh my
Uh,
god.
so I'm a little nervous. I think this is a perfect example of disruption. I think that the community and the employees and the viewpoint of Web 2 gaming companies can't make the Web 3 happen.
The thing that delights me is that like the framing around Ready Player One has been about sort of the battle between the suits and the real gamers, right? And so in a sense, I feel like what you're saying is kind of related in the sense that like, the suits aren't going to win this round, right? Like, which is good, right? It's good. I think the indies are going to win, and that's pretty neat.
At the same time, you look at Leaf from itch.io, which is like the most indie distribution platform for games, so successful, and he like wrote a diatribe around NFTs, like accused like threatened the moral character of anyone who'd even uttered the word NFT. He was so mad about it, and I think that there's certainly some sense to hating NFTs, right?
Yeah,
Like a lot of them suck. Let's go with more than a lot. 99%. 99.9%. It's like ICOs back in 2017.
yeah.
It just and it's hard for people who aren't in the space to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's just like really hard.
That is amazing. So tell me a bit kind of how you're reasoning about kind of things like novel play to earn mechanisms, things like increased sustainability in game economies. Like how are you reasoning about sort of how do we as an industry do better?
Right. So during my doctorate, I studied a lot about this concept called Playbour. And it's like a really well researched term, half play, half labor. You put them together. Basically, players increase the value of the IP they are using in various different ways, right? Sometimes it's through playing like an e-athlete and creating spectacle and people coming to watch. Sometimes it's through just playing on Twitch stream and hanging out and creating vibes. Sometimes it's through mods, reskins, full forks of the game, uh, fan fiction. There's an unlimited amount of ways in which a player can basically pump the bags of the publisher's
Oh,
IP.
I love it.
And and it's sad to watch this kind of exploitative work. And I wrote a lot about it actually. I wrote about Little Big Planet because it was like really early in the UGC world and we were
Beautiful game.
fascinated. Yeah, beautiful game. The team made 28 levels and the community made something like 28 million levels. And now, okay, quality wise, probably there's like 28,000 levels worth playing. But um, Little Big Planet was brilliant in that every level not only got harder, but harder to make. It was simultaneously training players how to play and how to build. And
Ah,
every reward, every like secret discovered was more materials to build with. It made discovering tools to build with, the reward, and thus
I love it.
encourage players to build. So smart. But like no player got anything for it, right? And it just seems like Web3 can promise a profit sharing of certain kind, where sure, you'll make a little bit less money as a game developer, but if you can share that profit, that might be like pouring gasoline on the UGC world. You might get way more productivity, a way bigger IP, if you find a sustainable way to share the value that players are creating.
I'm super excited about the Playbour construct, right? Because I'm very much a fan of what I call recognized entertainment value, right? So when I talk about recognized entertainment value, it's sort of like when someone says like I was entertained, and the way that that manifests economically is that they buy stuff, right? Like that's how they kind of signify the level of their entertainment, right? Now it's an imperfect measurement of how they were entertained, right? Like I've had raucously fun times playing things that were entirely free, and I didn't buy a single item, right? But like, so it's inexact. But I would say that like, it feels like things like League of Legends with skins and things like that, like, you start to move into the game, right? If the game is your world, like, it's totally worth it. Like, it's almost like,
100%.
yeah, absolutely. My son, has to kind of decide whether he wants to buy a physical pair of pants or whether he wants to buy a skin, and he looks way cooler in the digital skin and he spends more time in it. His friends are more impressed. So it's like, okay, skins it is.
Totally. So, I wrote this chapter once in a textbook on virtual item history.
Yeah.
And the first game item was in chainmail, which was basically trying to produce like these Prussian battlefields where people would be like playing like war on tables with like, those push pieces and the models, to make a proto, like, or at least a really well organized and well described rule set for war on a table.
Mm.
And at a certain point, they thought, well, we're playing in these medieval battlefields, and we're reading Lord of the Rings. So let's add mythical things, right? Let's add a magic sword. And it was
Yeah.
just a normal sword with a +1, right? Let's add a dragon. Let's add special arrows. These sort of pieces start showing up. And then Dungeons and Dragons comes out of chainmail. And then out of Dungeons and Dragons comes like 90% of all games ever,
Yeah.
right? Like formalized rules for combat. That's where it shows up.
Amazing.
Magic, spells, barbarians, classes, skill ups, treasure, loot, drops, everything comes from there. And we start playing around with like pay to win items in like the 2000s,
Yep.
and people get kind of upset about it, but they almost got more upset about cosmetics. People were like blown away by how insulting it was to pay for a Team Fortress hat. And and I thought it was ridiculous too. I was there just being a middle curver thinking it makes no sense. Why would you want a hat in a virtual world? The Apple earbuds for Mac users playing Team Fortress became the de facto currency of Team Fortress,
That's
right?
hilarious.
And we this history is so interesting, right? And then we tried to make a real money auction house with Diablo,
Yes. Yes,
free,
that was
and it
challenging.
failed, right? Because it broke the game loop. We realized that some games are just about getting items, and like if you can buy them, you quit. Everything makes no sense if you can just like skip the game loop.
It's like the
Uh,
win button.
yeah, it's
Win.
like literally pay to win. Like
Yeah.
it's like pay to end the game. Like that made no sense. It was like just toxic to the
Yes.
experience.
Yes.
So they closed it. And now we're back in this Web3 world where people are talking about items that are sellable and interoperable and purchasable. And the worry is that they're not going to learn the lessons that came before them, where like if you can let players pay to win, they will, and then they'll hate your game and you'll get a terrible, net promoter score.
Yeah, I've been thinking about what I think you got to see sort of my spiel in the Alliance my session, right? So I was talking about kind of these paths of honor, right? And in a sense, the idea of being a whale or wealth player, right, could be a full-fledged gameplay, right? But in a sense, the idea becomes about designing mechanisms that are non-toxic between these separably honorable roles, right? So in a sense, if you're famous, that's honorable, and if you're skillful, that's honorable, and if you're rich, being rich can be honorable, right? And you can be given rich person gameplay, right? And being devoted and spending a lot of time is honorable, right? And the thing that I think is so important is this non-toxicity, right? The non-toxicity is you can't take one of these kind of currencies and try to make it fungible with another, right? So it's sort of like, so to me, like each track kind of requires its own sort of first class gameplay, and in a way, like, you don't want to kind of create this amazing kind of toxic crisscrossing.
I remember. And I think there are interesting ways to do that. So the soulbound items in World of Warcraft were
Mm.
a first, right? Everyone was used to Diablo. It made no sense that an item would be stuck to you, right? But there's this sort of sense that if it's stuck to you, then that means that you have to earn it. You have to be there when it drops. And I
Yeah.
remember wanting to buy a soulbound item, and I went through with it like as a young teen. I like gave a guild like $50, and they let me into the raid, and I had to raid with them. And I
Yeah.
had to be there when the dragon dropped it. And it was an incredible experience. And it made totally sense. That's like the rich person paying for the experience that the like honorable locals, engage with
Oh,
every
oh,
day. And it
amazing.
didn't short circuit the loop. And it made me feel terrible about how bad I was at playing this game. I was like, I remember it was in Molten Core. Um, anyway.
Molten
Uh,
core, that's great. I love it. I love it. No, it's funny, right? Because if you connect that to the world, right, there's this whole idea of like rich people going up Mount Everest, right?
mhm.
Like that's totally like this vibe of like, I've got money, why don't I go up Mount Everest?
Yeah, it was so I feel it's so cringe in hindsight, but like,
That
so
mechanic is so interesting though, right? I mean, obviously the problem with things like bind on pickup, especially in crypto, is you can sell the whole freaking account, right? So it's bound to the account, but and obviously
and
if
that's what
it's
happened
even.
in WoW. I sold
Yeah.
Icarus, my $400, troll priest. At least I thought about selling him every day because $400 mattered a lot to me. But at the same time, it was so hard to sell something that I worked so hard on. I don't think I ever
Yeah, yeah, it is amazing. I assume my main is sitting in a deep freeze somewhere at Blizzard. At least I hope so.
did. Yeah, it would be worth going back to see.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, 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 and just jostle those bits again. But it to me, like, it's fascinating what you're describing, right? Because in a way, like, that is the future, and we just have to think about kind of how do we create. So, do you have ideas or examples of sort of ideal interactions between different player types? Because I think the whale player in crypto is unique and has a pretty unique role to play.
Yeah. I'll give an example from the ecosystem I'm most familiar with, which is Dark Forest.
Yeah,
So, Dark Forest is an independent game. It's never received venture capital. It has received a lot of grants from the community through Gitcoin, but also through benefactors. The team made a zero knowledge, like 4X space game, right? So you make a move, everyone knows it's valid, but they don't know where you made it until they hash that location. And there's so many locations to hash that's like really hard to get a sense of where that was.
very nerdy.
Very nerdy game. Ugly game. Terrible user experience. On XDAI. You have to spend a shit ton of money just to get your money over from ETH to XDAI, now called Gnosis Chain, to go play it.
Amazing.
You need to have a burner wallet. You need to understand a whole bunch of things. The game is slow. The but the nice things about it are it's all built on smart contracts. The entire state is on chain
Amazing.
and permissionless. So like even if the devs wanted to mint rarer NFTs, they couldn't. It's like built in the rules of the game, provably fair distribution.
Mm,
On top of that, they're all verified, so you can go see in the code like how those contracts were built and what the rarities are, and how to interact with them. And then the client on top is also open source. In fact, you can alter it for advantages. It turns out, and even Georgios, the CTO of Paradigm, like rebuilt the client to be headless. So there's just a command line interface to play the game, and you can have
wow.
bots play way faster this way sometimes. So fascinating experience. Lots of engineers getting nerd sniped into building on it. And what's cool is if you're going to win, you have to win through engineering. You need to script well. You need to have complex like robots playing for you. And then you get an NFT for winning.
I
And you
love
get
it.
another NFT if you open source what you built. And so the idea is people are constantly iterating, building, improving the experience, improving the UX, improving the client. We built a marketplace in the game itself, so it became play to earn, small amounts of money, but still play to earn through user interaction. That was crazy. And so the dev team just hands out these NFTs, says they're not worth anything, but collectors see them as valuable. And so these collectors have a very clear way to donate to the project, right? These whales
Yep.
get to, foster this community through its output of provably scarce NFTs, which is really interesting. And we've done pretty cool things. We built a smart contract that grouped players together. So it was like, we call it the Astral Colossus. And essentially, players only get an NFT from the top 63. And so in this contract, players can donate their points. And then pro rata, they get like tabulated as like their contributions. And then the contract came 33rd in the game. And so it has this sort of like reward NFT and this breakdown of how much every person deserves from that reward. That was like super cool. Uh, and then I myself like loved Dark Forest really early, tried to get hired to go do game design for them. And they're like, no, go do it yourself. Like, we're
Yes.
totally decentralized, right? And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? I've got a PhD in game design. I have 3 years experience building in crypto, and you're telling me you won't hire me and I have to do it for free again? Damn it, this sucks. And I did it anyway. Um, and what I did, because I wanted to win, was I recruited a team of various people with different abilities. I got Lindsay, who's now the Zapper content manager, and she was doing writing for Dark Forest. I got David Zhu, who's at now Rainbow, to do, because he was doing like tutorials and onboarding players. And these weren't engineers, but they were going to help with a robust view of how to build a real team and like almost like a company. Like if Dark Force was going to be the Ethereum protocol, we were going to be the for-profit parody that would like figure out ways to extract value ourselves, even if they wouldn't let us in. That was really cool.
That is amazing. I mean, I feel like that, which is, earlier I was describing this form of freedom, which is this kind of we make the rules, right? And in a sense, like that also kind of runs right across this kind of UGC Playbour construct, right? Where it's basically like, it's sort of a decentralized universe building construct. So, it's interesting because it's still fairly narrowly restrictive though, right? In the sense that you have to be pretty nerdy to like enjoy, appreciate, and then also to build.
Yeah, I think that we may be ahead of our time. Like if you look at people today who use email and Facebook and laptops, and like 20 years ago, that would have been really nerdy, right? And I think there's going to be this catching up of becoming just more technical, because the opportunities of being a technical person are going to grow. What's cool about Dark Forest also is the core team wants to decentralize. And so they came to our DAO and said, hey, we'd like you to run the next round. We'll let you launch the contracts and we'll let you launch them the way you want to launch them. And so we held a snapshot vote internally. We had our community propose rule changes. And then based on your scores in the last round, you were able to vote on what rule changes you wanted to see. We implemented them and we deployed. And that's totally about community making its own rules with its own freedom, with its own governance, building out gameplay. Like, isn't that amazing?
It is. So I have a cheeky question, and I'd love to get
Hmm.
your kind of mentality around it, right? Which is, aren't a lot of the DAO governance models pay to win?
Interesting. Well, here, um, your points were your voting, right? So you couldn't even buy a token to vote, right? You had to just get good if you wanted to have more governance.
That's cool. That's a good
Um,
model. I like that model.
yeah, I thought it was pretty nifty. I mean, at the same time, the people who are winning are more privileged, right? They have more time, more dedication, more resources, more engineering background. But those are also the people who are contributing the most to the game. They're the people who are building and who are operating and who are
But
caring.
zoom up a level, zoom up a level, zoom up a level into kind of like DeFi governance and zoom up a level
Sure,
into kind of general DAO governance. Like, aren't most DAOs pay to win?
sure. As in, like, the more you buy of the governance token, the more you
Yeah,
control it.
that's right.
Um, yes. depending on how the vote is scored. So at Alliance DAO, actually, our um, governance mechanism will be quadratic. So you take the log of your points in the DAO. So this is what we also did with Dark Forest. Someone who scores 1,000,000 points gets 7 votes, and someone who scores 100 gets 2. So although someone was, 10,000 times more powerful in game, they're only 3.5 times more governance empowered, because people matter at a fundamental level. Like Sybil resistance matters, and like figuring out ways to weight people according to their contribution and stake, but also their humanity and their voice. Right. So
Could there be, because I mean, one of the things Vitalik has said is that, any system involving more than two parties is attackable, right? So like, couldn't there be like in a quadratic system, couldn't you convert a quadratic system into a pay to win system by essentially like doing side deals, right? So you could basically go get people who are way down the long tail, right? Presumably the people at the head end might have a lot of economic means, right? So they could potentially like cheaply bribe people all the way down the tail and make them vote whatever way they want.
100%. You could build a smart contract that would basically reward people who voted a certain way in a snapshot.
Yeah.
And it could do it programmatically and at scale. Because what people forget about governance in the real world is there's repudiation of vote. So one of the professors at Concordia who I worked with, Jeremy Clark, he was an expert at cryptography for voting systems. And what he explained is one of the most difficult things to guarantee is that you can say you didn't vote that way to someone and they can't force you to prove it. But at the same time, you can guarantee that your vote was counted the right way. So
Yeah.
this tension is tough to solve for. Actually, impossible at a certain degree.
Yeah.
You have to make some compromise somewhere. But uh, if we're going to have unhackable elections or unbuyable elections, we need to have votes where no one can prove how they voted. Like it would be as easy to falsify yes as no.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very astute, and I think it's super important to kind of have these considerations. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is sort of like the nature of decentralization, right? And if you think about the nature of decentralization, decentralization may just be comprised of like many thousands of centralizations, right? So like, it's possible that there's some degree of centralization in a DAO, right? But that if you have thousands and thousands of them, then it's sort of effectively or de facto decentralized. I mean, how's your thought process around that?
Yeah, thinking about decentralization is tough because you think about like the way we do democracy now. Everyone votes, so it's a fully decentralized voting process, but we vote to centralize the power so that things can get done. Right? We
Yeah,
delegate,
yeah,
um, and I think that that's a totally reasonable way to do elections. Like if you can get a honest leader out of your game theoretical system, then you can basically solve all your problems. Like decentralization is not useful if you have an honest leader.
yes,
The
yes,
problem is in democracy, the people who get elected are more likely to be dishonest than honest because
yes,
of how power works and how corruption works.
yes.
And remember, there's this like Marxist colleague of mine at the university, and he said that probably a better system than democracy is random leader election. You just like pick a random number and choose a single citizen to be like head. And while they may be less competent, the odds of them being compromised by
Malevolent.
capital is like
Yes.
really low.
Yeah, that's super fun. That's a super fun idea, right? Because so you're really refactoring for a different kind of maximal or optimal outcome. I mean, if you go back to kind of like Plato's Republic, right, there is this idea of the philosopher king who kind of doesn't actually want power or rulership, right? So you kind of have to drag them kicking and screaming, right? It's like, hey, you're the ruler now, So like it's interesting. I mean, what would be amusing would be to create a game theoretical system that actually penalizes people for wanting to be the leader and decreases the chances that they'll become it.
Sure. And I've done a deep dive in leadership election mechanisms. There are so many with interesting mechanisms for preventing collusion. Like, I remember there's this one example where there are kids trying to pick the class president, but there are four like bad kids who are going to
Yeah.
vote after everyone else has voted, and they're going to basically sneak like a cabal to pick one person to win. And there's a very fascinating solution for that problem, which is the first thing people do before even voting is choose one of 8 baskets. And the basket where the fewest number of people are become the basket that votes in the election. And
Whoa.
so all the bullies have to divide themselves evenly in different baskets. Otherwise, if they fill up one basket, they can't work together and collude.
That's
And
cool.
so interesting. Um, I often think about Captain America
Mm.
when I think
Mm.
about leadership elections,
Yeah.
and I have this weird like story about Captain America. So everybody understands that Wolverine's real power isn't bones of metal or claws of metal; it's regenerative healing, right? And because he's so good at regenerating, you cover his bones with adamantium, he can heal up, and then he's supercharged, right? But his true power was never metal bones; it was healing.
Yes.
Captain America is very similar. People think that Captain America's superpower is super strength or a very nice shield, but really he's morally good, like to a superhero
Wow.
degree, right? And that's why he's able to take the super serum and not be corrupted, right? Like whereas everyone else is at a
Oh.
risk, like an existential threat to humanity if we give super serum to someone who's not purely good, and we have that example with like Red Skull. Um, and so when Captain America, right, wants to do something, he doesn't want to listen to a democracy. He's like, I'm the leader you elected. I can tell you what exactly you need to do. And that's why he has the civil war with Iron Man. Because
Yes.
Iron Man is he's like the anti-hero of sorts, right?
He's an Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly. And so he knows that he can't make correct decisions. But if democracy tells him what to do, he'll at least be at the service of the masses. And so that's why he sides with the US government and why Captain America, ironically, fights against him. And that's this clash, right? Versus leader election versus democracy.
I
Uh,
love this framing because it absolutely plays to that theme I was talking about earlier, right? Which is character laws and then like universe laws, right? So, if you look at MCU, Marvel, like it's definitely super interesting to see this tension, right, between the character laws. Captain America reminds me almost of like your description reminds me almost of a Lord of the Rings character, which is Tom Bombadil, right? So like, in a sense, like he's the type of character that could just put the ring of power on and then be like, "Wow, this is really neat," and then like you can have it back now, right? Like there's nothing happening, right? He's like, "I don't
why
care."
doesn't Tom Bombadil blow up the ring? Tell me why. I don't know.
It's amazing, right? Because he's just like he's enjoying things like they are. Maybe I mean it's insane. It's definitely like it has that vibe. I mean, it's funny because Tom Bombadil's involvement is different from Captain America's involvement, right? So I think they're definitely have different character laws, but like the idea that they both flow out of this fairly like pure and kind of untouchable.
Uncorruptible.
Yes,
Yeah.
uncorruptible wellspring, right? So I mean, I think it's interesting because I think that beyond that, like Captain America also has kind of like a sense of duty, whereas Tom Bombadil's free. Like he's just like, I'm free. Like I don't owe you anything. Like, we're just having fun here together kind of feeling.
Sure.
Yeah, that is amazing. So kind of looping around towards sort of promising mechanisms, promising projects, like what are the things that you've been seeing that you're excited about?
So right now in our cohort, we have this game called Steppen, and it's doing a great job. It's a move to earn game is one way to describe it. Web3 Strava or
Yeah,
Run
yeah,
Fitness.
like sweat
Um,
coin.
yeah, and the idea is like you buy a pair of shoes and you walk, and then your shoes get worn out and you run out of energy, but during that time you make some money. And you can use that money to repair your shoes, have a little left over to invest in those shoes, then make a little bit more money next time. and it's this kind of uh, promise, right, of move to earn. Now, you have to think right away: is that sustainable, right? Is someone who's moving to earn in this game creating value for the developers? And if not, then why are we paying them, and how long can we afford to do this before we run
Yeah.
out, right?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
and the answer is kind of like they are to a degree, because while they're doing it, they're shilling the game. They're telling their friends about it. And then at some point, there'll be mechanics for running with people and getting more points, just in the way that, like, WoW
That
rewarded
feels a
people.
little Ponzi-nomic though, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it is very Ponzi-nomic. And one of the interesting things they do to curb the Ponzi-nomics is the repair costs, the durability is this interesting secret. So people think that they're like making a shit ton of money, but really there's a huge capital cost up front to buy the shoes, and you're always repairing your shoes and cutting into your margins. And so at a certain point, um, like the economy will collapse, but it looks more like um, when people used to do that weird app thing where they'd like give the app $20 and the app would only give them back the $20 if they ran every day that week. It's like
Oh,
it's like forcing people to
I
run
love that.
because they
I
have to
love that.
recover the capital cost of
Yes.
having invested in
Yeah.
this shoe.
Yes.
And the threat is if you don't do it right now, you won't recover the cost before the pyramid collapses. And so you'll be out the value of your shoe. And I love that incentive. I think it's super funny. The worrisome part is that people aren't aware that they're engaging in a pyramid, right?
Yes.
That
Yes.
this economy is not long for this world, and we don't,
Yes.
and no one knows when it will end. Maybe the people who are really good job at modeling it, but that that's a tricky piece.
It's a
And that
bit
speaks. Mhm.
it's a bit it sounds a bit like the degen rebasing things, like based and like yam and like that kind of, where it's sort of like it's sort of structured around collapsing. I mean, that's design collapse, but but it definitely sounds kind of like get out at the right time kind of game.
Sure, and like the thing is, if we look at its success, currently it's third in the U.S. health apps and fifth in Japan. It's got 10,000% growth from last month,
Amazing.
and that's what tokenomics can do, right? But the problem is still like the misinformation piece. We're not actively trying to deceive, but people are not built or trained to think about this kind of tokenomic model, right? We didn't grow up that way. And this is something I like to talk about, which is, bear with me on this very long metaphor.
Mm.
Um, for a while, we had brokered sex. You had to go through a priest, which is sanctioned by the state, and you couldn't do peer-to-peer sex. You had to like actually find someone who'd do some like order book matching.
An
Um,
intermediary.
yes, an intermediary. And at a certain point, now this wasn't always the case, and it wasn't everywhere, but like North America felt that way for a while, and Europe as well. And so the idea was we came up with this mechanism in the '60s for peer-to-peer fucking, and this this is what free love was all about. But with that peer-to-peer protocol, there were still a lot of kinks. Like it was V1, and by kinks I mean like way worse than kinks: sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies. We had to like revolutionize science to handle these two problems. Um, Also, non-consensual sex, like a whole slew of things that took like 60 years to like begin to tackle it with any reasonable amount of success. And I feel like by disintermediating finance and finance and games, we're stuck at the same problem where a lack of education is holding people back, lack of education and tooling. So now we know
So you need
in
sex
school,
ed.
you need sex ed. We need DeFi ed, basically. Without it, people are not going to make sound decisions. And that makes sense. Like we're basically affording 14-year-olds to go like 100x leverage long cat JPEGs. And that's a problem. We haven't trained 14-year-olds to not go 100x leverage long cat JPEGs.
That's good. That's good. I see. I see. So really you're asking people to kind of practice safe smart contracts basically.
Yeah, practice safe finance. And it's hard, right? We don't know what that means even. We haven't developed the playbook for doing that. And so what the regulator response is, ban sex, ban the gay sex, ban the loose sex, ban this kind of sex, don't police rape. Like, and like, that was a mistake. Like, we shouldn't have done that. We should have just like gone full sale education with a lot of money very fast, if we were going to solve this problem. And so now we have the same problem with regulators saying ban the DeFi, push everything to the black market, make everything way worse and dangerous. Mistake.
That's so intriguing, right? Because you're really talking about sort of, obviously you're talking about sort of the role of the intermediary, right? So in a sense, the intermediary kind of historically has performed sort of a protective function, right?
Yeah, in finance for sure. Making sure you're sober of mind. Like the portfolio manager's like, tell me about your risk tolerance. If this would happen, what would you do? If this would happen, what? And then they have to like then operate on behalf of like an informed decision from you, right?
Got it.
They've served that gating role for us.
I see. I see. So you're kind of Spider-Manning with the great power comes the great responsibility, right? So people have to figure out like how to do this.
Yeah, being your own bank was not what it was cracked up to be, sir. It is an enormous burden.
Yeah, it is really kind of amazing. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking lately about like things like Bitcoin is in a way like one way of looking at Bitcoin is that it's kind of incredibly nice. And what I mean by it's incredibly nice is that the volatility means that it keeps offering you a good price, right? Like it's sort of like, oh, did you miss the last good price? It's like, okay, I'm going to offer you another good price, right? And it's so funny, right? Because the thing that's such an incredible monkey puzzler, right, is that it offers you the best price when everybody is in the streets screaming bloody murder, right? And it looks like the asteroid's going to hit the earth, right? And so like that's when it offers you the best price, right? It's basically
Of
like,
course.
you want to buy now, so it's this really hilarious game, right? But in a way it's kind of generous, right? It's generous because it's like, oh, you missed the last good price. It's like, okay, fine. Okay, fine. I'm going to offer you another good price, right? But people don't enjoy that. People generally are like, I don't know. I mean, it takes guts, I guess.
Yeah, people like to buy high and sell low, right? It's
Yeah.
their favorite thing to do.
Yeah, that feels safer, right? It feels really safe, right? But it's
Hmm.
provably unsafe. Yeah. Practice. Okay, you heard it here on the Miko Bits show. Practice safe Bitcoin. Yeah, this has been amazing, and really great having you. So let's do this again.
I'd love to. Thanks so much.
You bet. Thanks so much.